On January 7, 2026, the federal government released the new Dietary Guidelines for Americans, introducing an upside-down food pyramid and several noticeable shifts in nutrient guidance that immediately drew national attention and intense scrutiny. I am so excited to welcome you back to the Exam Room Nutrition Podcast. I'm your host, Colleen Sloan. I'm a registered dietitian and a PA, and for this first episode of 2026, I'm bringing you the Nutrition Newsroom. This is a special segment where we break down the latest nutrition headlines and translate what that means for clinicians. Now, today's a first because I am joined by 9 other nutrition experts to help me unpack the new dietary guidelines. We're going to talk about what's new, what's different, and what might be missing. Now, as always, I would love for you to join in the conversation. So if you're listening and you have thoughts or questions or maybe a reaction to something that we had said, go tag me on Instagram at Exam Room Nutrition and let me know what stood out to you. Now, before we dive into the guidelines, I actually want to start with something that often gets overlooked. It's what these guidelines actually are and how they're created. Now, if you're not a dietitian, you may be completely unaware that there is a massive process to how we get these guidelines. So here's a quick history lesson for you. Every 5 years since 1980, the U.S. government released an updated set of recommendations on healthy eating called the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. These have served as the cornerstone of U.S. nutrition policy for nearly half a century. The U.S. Department of Agriculture first promoted the food pyramid in 1992. This is actually adapted from a concept that originated in Sweden back in the 1970s. Then in 2005, we got our food guide pyramid. And then in 2011, that visual shifted to MyPlate, which is a simpler depiction of food groups and portion balance. Now, while these guidelines are often discussed as like clinical guidelines, that's actually not their role. They're not meal plans. They're not indicated to teach an individual how they should eat. They are population level guidance. They help shape federal nutrition programs like SNAP, school meals, and food served in childcare and elder care settings. This is why a lot of dietitians are irritated with these guidelines. I really want to hear from Gisela about how this might impact her work moving forward.
Thanks so much, Colleen. I do menu reviews for healthcare facilities. I help to develop menus, particularly behavioral health, assisted living facilities, and childcares. So for me, this really impacts my work because the former guidelines had the set recommendations for every life stage, every population. And by not having that, we went from 164 pages to 10 pages. The guidelines were very specific. How many red and green vegetables they need per week, how many servings of fish, how many legume servings. So very specific to ensure that you were feeding your patients not only macronutrients, but their micronutrients. And those guidelines have been taken away. So now when I work with facilities, yes, I can say, well, yes, the CACFP requires this. I don't have a stronger document to say, hey, this is my reference to ensure that we're meeting nutrients, to ensure that that menu is diverse enough to get there. And so my concern is, especially working now on this side as a private practice, working with smaller facilities, this is an issue I can only imagine in hospitals, because hospitals, the menu development there really depends on those guidelines. What are they going to do now? Like what are clinicians going to advocate for as far as how they're feeding their patients?
Now, who creates these guidelines? Traditionally, each update is developed through a multi-year process. The Department of Health and Human Services and the USDA appoint a scientific advisory committee made of vetted experts. That committee spends about 2 years, and I heard over 1,000 hours individually reviewing literature, developing protocols for specific research questions, synthesizing the strongest available evidence, and inviting public and scientific comment along the way. This is rigorous work. This work culminates in a large scientific report, which federal agencies then translate into public-facing dietary guidelines. But this year, however, was a little bit different. Instead of relying solely on the traditional advisory committee report, the 2026 dietary guidelines were informed by a separate scientific report published in January. According to the guidelines, the administration determined that adopting the original advisory committee report would not meet the public's need for objective, evidence-based nutrition guidance, and an independent evidence review process was implemented. That process looked different from established methodology used for many years. I'm going to link to an article giving you all the details because this is that goes into a little bit more detail than we have time for in the episode today. But if you're interested in the development process, check the show notes for more information. Okay, so let's get into these guidelines. I want to open the floor to kind of let's talk about what stayed the same because it's interesting. All the chatter online, people are like, either they love it or they're like, this is so revolutionary. This is incredible. And honestly, when you look at it, there's a lot of similarities. But before we even do that, I have to talk about the elephant in the room, and we will not spend a lot of time on it. But what do y'all think of the new upside down pyramid, the new image? Let's unpack that for just a few seconds. I want to hear your thoughts on this.
Okay, you done did it. I'm going to jump in immediately and I'm going to share thoughts on that, Colleen. So, 7 years ago, 8 years ago, me and a buddy decided to go to a dude's flick and we went to go see The Last Jedi. And after we walked out of that film, my feeling was left kind of empty inside. And my reaction to this new food pyramid, this upside down one, is extremely specific to my reaction seeing the movie, which is the more I thought about it, the less I liked it. So my point about looking at the reflections about the food choices, and the more I've dug into it, I've not walked away with any insights of thinking, that's clever. That was a good idea, as opposed to just thinking, who is using this and what is this going to be telling you? And I'll stop it right there. But I mean, there's like some items on there where I can't like even tell what these are. I can't tell like why this choice was made. Why is there an entire turkey at the top? Why does it look like there's a couple of golden puffs at the bottom? It's hard to piece this whole thing together.
The sprinkles at the bottom got me. I'm like, is it oats or rice? So, anyway, okay. Who else? Because this is just a fun conversation. We won't rip it apart too much.
For me, what was interesting is getting consumers' perspective on the pyramid. And for me, it even asked the question like, is the public asking for something simpler? I think part of the reason that I think people liked it was the website was very consumer friendly. It was very short. So part of me, like the consumer dietitian, like the media dietitian part of me is saying, is it that consumers are also looking for that very simple type of image, but at the same time, the dietary guidelines are meant for a lot more. So I think the conversation that I heard and myself, just in the nutrition professional, the research world is like, where is the scientific justification? I mean, we're used to citations because we know this is not just, a consumer driven tool. So I think there was like a disconnect because some consumers were like, yes, this is super simple, very marketing friendly. Whereas in the research and just nutrition profession where we're like, uh, what else? Like, what else? Right? Like, what do you mean? Like 10 pages? But it's just interesting to me. Like, do we need two sets of guidelines? One that's like a very friendly PDF that citations. I would love that. So I'm just curious to hear what everybody thought, but that's been an interesting conversation between the two sides, if you want to call it.
The new guidelines are not do not appear to be revolutionary to me. Of course, yeah, the upside down pyramid is very um it's different because it's inverted and it's kind of a bit funny to somebody who's been a dietitian for over 25 years because I stopped using the food guide pyramid when I was working in public health 20 something years ago. So, so it doesn't, it's not new. There's not a lot of new that's in here. I think it's also confusing because the dietary guidelines are recommendations for policy and for health professionals. They have never been intended to be a consumer facing recommendation. So the dietary guidelines, the fact that in this version they introduced a graphic, i.e., the upside down pyramid, is definitely something revolutionary because you have dietary guidelines, and then maybe a couple years or a few years later they introduce maybe a new graphic like MyPlate or a pyramid or something like that. But instead, this committee came out of the gate. We're going to make some new recommendations. We're going to maybe veer away from the body of scientific evidence and cherry pick. And we're going to do this behind closed doors. And we're also going to introduce a new graphic that got a lot of consumer attention. I think the good news out of this is I don't think there's ever been more common people like, my sisters commenting to me like, "Oh, did you see the new dietary guidelines?" Like, you work in entertainment. How would you even know that there's new dietary guidelines?
Yeah, I think another thing that we'll talk about is that the picture doesn't really line up with the actual wording in their guidelines, right? We will definitely unpack saturated fat. That's a big one, right? There's so many pictures of high saturated fat foods, but yeah, the guideline is still limited at 10%. But before we get into the, the differences and really getting to the nitty-gritty, there's a lot of similarities between our old guidelines. And I do want to talk about that because I think that's also important, right? I mean, we don't need to hate on these. It kind of is what it is. We have to learn to live with them and learn to educate our patients on them. So let's stay the same. We know that we've always recommended and promoted whole foods. The other guidelines recommended a limit on sugar and on sodium. So I would love to hear kind of what do you guys think is similar? What do you like about these new guidelines?
I'll jump in. I think I like the whole food aspect of it. I like how we're limiting processed foods. I do think that there is such an abundance of added sodium and sugar, and I think we do have to get down to basics and focus on common sense, but it's so, as you said, it's so open to interpretation. It's what is the common sense? And I think working in primary care, if somebody comes to me with IBS, for example, and you say, okay, well, tell me a typical day of what you have to eat. Get a little bit of a diet history, and they're skipping meals and they're having 10 cups of coffee a day and they're having all these added sugar foods. And I'm like, well, before we go any further, let's just pare that down a little bit and go back to the basics. So I think that was something that I really liked. And the one thing that I did like about the image was there's bananas and there's grapes, and I think those get demonized quite a bit. And I was like, oh, hooray, let's celebrate bananas and grapes, trying to be optimistic about the image.
I completely agree with you with the whole grape situation. I'm actually surprised that they put that on there. I also love with the image, going back to that there are pictures of frozen and canned veggies, which I think is really helpful because that's important. And I also thought it was interesting that they did not mention organic at all, which I love. And, majority of us know that organic doesn't necessarily mean healthier or better. And so I do like that they didn't highlight any photos of like organic on that picture. So I think that was really interesting.
I was just going to comment that I feel like I'm a little bit opposite of Dustin. Not that I prefer this. My LinkedIn post we've discussed. I very much am a MyPlate fan. I think it's practical, teachable, but it's growing a little more on me. And Colleen, like you said, we do have to work with it now. So I think the way that we can use the visual is thinking of it as maybe like a shopping list, items to discuss with our patients. Although not perfect, and we'll get into that, I see it as a broader pulling back on what foods to choose, whereas I'm still certainly going to use my plate as a practical daily use for teachable moments. So that's where I stand with it. But I certainly think both could be used together. I don't think I would use it in isolation.
And the placement of the fruits and vegetables, while I've worked in the fresh produce industry for more than a decade, and I love seeing fresh produce graphically represented on any visual of health guidelines, the placement seems a bit esoteric in a way. Like when I saw bananas at the bottom near the tip, my reaction was like, why would you put banana? And then I thought, oh, well, yeah, common, perception of bananas is that they're not good. They're not as virtuous as, say, a blueberry or an avocado. And then you have a stick of butter right in the center of that. So anyway, that's my comments. I'll go back on mute.
I love it. I think you make some really interesting points. And so I want to just read briefly the 10-page document. They have like little headers. And so a lot of it sounds like what we've heard from the previous guidelines. So it says, eat the right amount for you. Prioritize protein foods at every meal. Consume dairy, which we will get to. Eat vegetables and fruits throughout the day. Incorporate healthy fats. We will get to that. Focus on whole grains. Limit highly processed foods, added sugars, and refined carbohydrates. There's a little blurb for added sugars, which, okay, makes sense. Sugar's a carbohydrate. But then under limit alcoholic beverages, there's like a little side box that's like sodium. It's a very random placement to be under the alcoholic beverages. Then we get into special populations and considerations. So we've got infancy and early childhood, middle childhood, adolescents, and there's about like 4 bullet points for those, which I think is not significant enough. Young adulthood, pregnant women, lactating women, older adults, individuals with chronic disease, and then a spot for vegetarians and vegans. And so, again, like a lot of these, they're not really new guidelines, they're very minimal. Now, you can open up the 90-page scientific advisory report, there are a little bit more details in there. Now, let's move on since I think we've all kind of unpacked like what's similar, what we like. Let's unpack what's new, what have they changed? I think I want to start with the hottest topic, which is going to be fat.
So I'll just say a couple of things because I worked in the avocado industry as it was ramping up. Back in 2014 is when I started, and I know there's a lot of younger dietitians on this call, but back in 2014, people were not gobbling up avocados. You didn't see avocado toast everywhere. And we were not allowed to say avocados were a healthy fruit because they were over the threshold of 30% of the total calories from fat, which, if you remember the dietary guidelines, only up till the 2020 version, so 5 years ago, did it make the distinction between it's the type of fat that's important, not the percentage of the fat. So it was a huge victory in the avocado land that by 2016, we kind of knew we were going to be able to say that avocados were a healthy fruit. And the distinction was being made between like the good and the bad fats, although I don't like that, good and bad terminology. Healthy, even working for a USDA funded commodity board, so the Haas Avocado Board, and now, of course, I work for Pears, you would have to be in compliance with what that guideline was, what that definition was. And so now that they've muddled the waters and saying that saturated, it's basically back to it. There's no change, like all fats are the same. There's the playing field is completely the same. And USDA would never allow you to say healthy and fat in the same sentence anyway, because fats were not something that could be qualified as healthy. I think it's going to be very confusing. Hopefully nobody will really pay attention, like they've never paid attention to dietary guidelines. But I think if people see this inverted pyramid and they see steak and they see a stick of butter and they think that's just as good, I think it's a free-for-all for bacon lovers. Nothing against bacon, but you shouldn't be having it every single day or three meals a day. And although I know that the science on the milk fat globule is evolving and may have some benefits for neurological health and maybe for development, I don't think we have enough information at this point to change U.S. dietary guidelines when heart disease is the #1 killer of all Americans. Like, to make that change is just a radical thing. So
I'll jump in really quick with that too, and just pointing out that one of the most well-studied items we've seen in nutrition science that's been reproduced and rigorously evaluated is the causal relationship between saturated fat and cardiovascular disease. We know it's causal, that intake of saturated fat elevates LDL. We know that elevated LDL is causal in the progression of atherosclerosis. So you have these two items where they are working contradictory to each other, of, like Barb said, promoting these foods that are high in saturated fat that don't have much redemptive quality aside from that, but at the same time retaining this cap and saying, oh, but keep your saturated fat calories to less than 10% of energy, which is something carried over from the previous guidelines. And unfortunately, these two messages are irreconcilable with one another. And I've even seen some early food pattern modeling, which has shown that you can't pull these together. You can't promote these and meet these recs at the same time with one another.
So if we go into saturated fats from animal sources, in the chain lengths and stuff, not all saturated fats are created equal. There's short chain fatty acids, there's medium chain fatty acids, and there's long chain fatty acids, right? And if we go down to the definition of a saturated fat, all it means is a carbon atom that's surrounded by hydrogen electrons, right? And so I think what's going on with the science and the connection between oxidation and damage that leads to plaque buildup is the science right now is saying when we eat things that are high in, for example, polyunsaturated fatty acids and the oil is damaged, it becomes oxidized. When things become oxidized, it allows oxidation to occur. And that's what's directly linked to plaque buildup and LDL formation. And that's what they're discussing in grad schools right now, especially in the the doctorate programs of osteopathy. And I think that's why these guidelines are coming out, because at that level, and that progressive level, that's what they're discussing is which type of oils are causing oxidation, what is involved with baseline inflammation, what is actually the root cause of heart disease, not necessarily what kind of LDL is what is causing plaque buildup. So when we think of it from that perspective, and I see these guidelines coming out, to me, that is lining up with what's being discussed right now in graduate programs versus what's already been made policy. And we all know when we make policy in the field of cardiology and nutrition, it's usually 10 years behind, lagging.
Yeah, it seems a little premature to change policy and dietary guidance if things are being discussed right now. The American College of Cardiology and the American Heart Association, this is the world that their lives revolve around. And they bring in scientific advisories and panel experts from across the scope of the science. I mean, we have decades and decades of science that indicate that the polyunsaturated fats and the monounsaturated fats are the ones that by and large protect us from cardiovascular disease. So although there probably are exceptions to that, there are not large meta-analysis that have been replicated or clinical trials that have been produced. I mean, science doesn't evolve that quickly either, right? So it takes 7 years to do a clinical trial before it can be accepted into FDA for even consideration.
What you're saying, yes, is true. The science does have to translate into policy eventually. What I'm commenting on is what's currently right now being discussed in graduate school programs at these schools on research, what's coming up in gut microbiome, how inflammation is studied. But the problem is that's all discussion right now. It's not necessarily, I don't know, like from my perspective, I don't know if the evidence is strong enough to make policy change at this right now. That's the comment I want to make right now. Yeah.
I'll jump in again on this one, and I'm going to make it clear that I'm being respectful. I'm offering pushback respectfully on what Crystal is offering on this one, but I agree and I accept the fact that you can have nuance in the current research literature, which is trying to evaluate if there's a difference in our response to saturated fats coming from animal sources and coming from dairy sources, because there are differences. There are odd chain versus even chain fatty acids. And I respect that there is nuance in that literature. I have not read or seen anything that has convinced me to say that you can lump saturated fats from dairies and animals into the same category. I still think that overall the net effect is bad. But beyond that point too, the discussions that you mentioned, I've been following those for a long time, and I've never seen them rooted in anything other than very weak observational data that doesn't take into consideration the many randomized controlled trials where we replace PUFAs with saturated fats, where we replace MUFAs with saturated fatty acid sources, and we see that on that one. So despite the discussions, even if there are ongoing discussions, those have been happening for a long time. And I would more so agree with Barb that the policy maneuver towards this, on the one hand, is ultimately just confusing, but I also don't think reflects any new evidence ultimately.
My comment is not going to be as scientific as Barb's and Dustin's and Crystal's, but where my brain went first when I read this was, so I went to a lipid-centric university, and our director of the dietetics program is Dr. Joanne Carson, and this was her bread and butter, pun intended. The impact of this, it almost my initial worry was this is going to give everyone permission to just go and eat sticks of butter and go back to what was the bulletproof coffee, where it was packed with coconut oil and sticks of butter. And I will never forget, I had probably 10 years ago a patient on my heart failure unit who just cooked everything in bacon fat. Everything was cooked in bacon fat. And I'm just thinking, oh, this is, what is this going to imply and translate to for the kind of general population? I suppose that's where my brain went. And I think we have to be very careful with, portions and quantities of these things as well. And I think that's where our roles are very important as clinicians. But that's where my brain went. But thank you for that insight from all of you. That's really, really great.
I mean, for me, I think this is the part that is frustrating, because the dietary guidelines are meant to help us answer these questions. And traditionally, I mean, they use these top researchers that this is what they do, and they have the science justification to say, what is the evidence to say, are we pointing in this direction? Moreover, what questions and research are needed? I think that was what I used to love in the past recommendations, that they kind of gave us much more evidence on where do we stand, on where is the research now, and where do we need to be. We're really not there yet. We have a lot of information now on the differences in saturated fat between, dairy versus animal. Yes, there's differences. So I was really looking forward to say, where are we, right? Based on these reviewers of multiple data. And I think that is what we're missing. That is, for me, really was the guiding principle. And so here I'm just disappointed because I don't have anything new. And if I do have it, it's like, how are you coming up with that data? So this is what the dietary guidelines were meant to do. And I think this time around, it fails because it doesn't give me the scientific justification of how you're doing it, of who you're doing it, the transparency.
Yeah, the dietary guidelines and what the consumers see should be reflecting what that scientific advisory committee had recommended. And so if you go into their report, so I have it to the side, I wanted to show that they say, the recommendation versus did they put that into the dietary guidelines? And when you look at that, it shows that they did not input the recommendations to continue to emphasize low fat or non-fat dairy. They did not implement the limit consumption of red and processed meat. They did not implement the recommendation to enhance the guidance to replace saturated fat with unsaturated fat. So the scientific advisory committee, who did look at all that available evidence and synthesize it, said we should be continuing to emphasize limit saturated fat, replace with unsaturated fat. And you see that they explicitly put out there, we did not follow those recommendations and put together our own. So yes, that is frustrating to see that. No, the science has not really changed. I mean, the science is supporting something different than what's actually in these final reports.
Also pretty frustrated that the language is very biased towards specific oils, and they left out a lot of the contentious seed oils. I'm in the camp that seed oils are not the enemy, and that within moderation, you can safely consume seed oils. I think it was very interesting that they specifically only recommended olive oil, right? They said when cooking with or adding fats to meals, prioritize oils with essential fatty acids, but then they only said olive oil, which actually is missing some of the essential fatty acids. So I think that's contradictory as well. And then they put other options can include butter or beef tallow. I sense a lot of bias there, and I think that was really, really frustrating for me. Any final comments on fat before we move on?
The other day, I did try to make breakfast based on these guidelines. And I did the personalized nutrition there, 10% saturated fats, whatever. Easily, hands down, easily over 50% in one meal, saturated fats. So I'm worried. I'm worried. I'm not like anti-saturated fat or pro-saturated fat. I'm just worried that these guidelines, the average person has a 5th to 6th grade reading level. They're going to look at that and be like, oh, butter's healthy. Perfect. I'm going to have butter and everything now. And that has like a low smoke point. So I'm like,
yeah,
really worried.
Okay, another thing, since we're on fats, I want to just briefly touch on dairy because, again, we've talked about it. They really call out to include full fat dairy. Now, I like the fact that they say with no added sugar. So they're recommending against, chocolate milk, strawberry milk, flavored milk, which I can vibe with that. But I also, what about, the percentage of patients who are lactose intolerant or who for cultural or religious reasons don't consume dairy? There's no mention of the other milk alternatives. And I think that is a very important missed point. Like those are wonderful options that is completely missing from these guidelines.
I mean, I'm going to push back against the additives on the dairies because chocolate milk. I preach it to the athletes I work with, the youth athletes. Sometimes that's the only thing those kids get to drink. And now you're telling me with these dairies, that if now I only have chocolate milk to give my kid because now that's the only way I can get them extra calories or I can get them extra carbs so that they can actually perform better just throughout the day because they might not get breakfast. They might not even eat school lunch. And now the only thing they're given is this chocolate milk from point A to point B. And now that's not even an option because we're saying the additives. Are we really helping America? Are we helping our kids?
Tony, I love that you went there. And actually, that moves me nicely into that next section I want to talk about. I want to talk about sugar and their specific language that they used on sugar with kids, because I'm a pediatric PA and I'm actually with you. I talk about chocolate milk all the time. I drink chocolate milk post workout. It tastes great. It's hydrating. There's so many great benefits to it. And, when we talk about added sugars, when I've got underweight kiddos, some of the easiest things to add in are spreads, right? Like Nutella, chocolate spreads. Those are wonderful added sources of calories. Yes, they have sugar, but I'm trying to get this child to gain weight, right? So I want to hear how you guys feel, especially from the peds people or even just parents on the call, how you feel about the language with their, avoiding added sugar until age 10. How are we going to navigate with this with our parents? And honestly, how realistic is this?
I think my daughter had a pop for dinner last night. So I mean, sometimes you got to get them to eat something, and if it's a popsicle, that's it.
Yeah, I would say the same thing. I'm not a pediatric dietitian, but I'm a mom of three. And, sugar brings nostalgia, brings memories. We love going out for ice cream. There's no reason why we can't enjoy it. And if we're really teaching our kids to be mindful eaters and, be their own explorers of food and what they like and dislike, that is also in sweet things. And so there's nothing wrong. I mean, limiting to age 10, it really is impossible unless we're going to overhaul every food system and food product out there. It's not going to happen. And we have to consider that.
I think also with kiddos in primary care, if they've got borderline ARFID kind of presentation, and then I had a dentist tell my borderline underweight kiddo not to have flavored milks anymore because of their teeth, and I was like, ooh, yes, I see their point. However, I think we really need to focus on the growth of this child, and then we can transition as we're kind of like food chaining and things transition off of the sugary milk. But for now, we need this.
And I know it's not exactly relevant specifically for peds, but lumping in added sugars with non-nutritive sweeteners is dumb. Hate speech. We should be calling it that instead. It's that point of information that was added into it where they said on the same, like avoiding it too. That was for me where when I dug into the science and the literature about the justification behind that was where the whole thing really started to break down for me, because number one, there was just so many basic errors, from like spelling errors to citational errors to like misattributed citations, when again, there's a robust body of evidence demonstrating how when you use diet beverages as substitutions for regular sugar beverages, there's benefits, weight benefits, cardiometabolic benefits, especially for people with disease states. I mean, that one in particular, like blew my mind seeing that one added in.
I mean, people who wrote this clearly have never counseled a patient on making changes, right? Like, I am totally with you. Non-nutritive sweeteners and those sugar-free, calorie-free sodas are a great stepping stone to get someone who's drinking 10 cans of regular soda to eventually get to drinking all plain water. But that jump is too drastic for anyone to maintain. And so I completely agree with you. I hate that they lump that in and have that language on non-nutritive sweeteners. Marina, I'd love to hear from you. You're my pediatric dietitian on call. What are your thoughts on this added sugar conversation?
I mean, I think in general, as a peds RD, just a little perspective, the 2020 Dietary Guidelines were the first guidelines to include infants. And we had 39 pages of just immense research-specific nutrients. And all of a sudden, I see 2 pages. And so this was just very, very frustrating because I had nothing on special nutrients, on just even breastfeeding storage recommendations, the language that is used, even a mention when we're talking about added sugars, the mention of sugar sweetened beverages, which is the number one source of added sugars. And this is the number one source that kids consume. So just there's absolutely no practicality here. And I get it. I am all for how can we minimize added sugar? Because I always say, yes, we can reduce the amount of added sugar, but we can also help parents improve their relationship with food and not demonize. It could be yes and, right? It's not mutually exclusive. And so I think there's just a lack of nuance, lack of realistic expectations. Yes, let's find ways, but could we have done a range, right? Let's reduce it to 10 grams because A, B, and C, and we found that the research says A, B, and C. But again, why 10 years and not 11? And why not 8, right? Is there a difference of why 10 and not 8? So just
I find the language within this document is very consistent with the language presented on social media, right? Fear mongering, very negative, making everyone afraid of certain foods. And I don't think that should be the present language in a federal government document that's made, for guidelines. I just think that's an inappropriate way to present this information. Barb, you're going to say something.
Yeah, you did say exactly what I was going to say, like the negative overtones and the preachiness of this seemed a little bit like offensive in a way. And of course, again, I'll say this again. I come from the fresh produce industry, right? I've spent the last decade trying to get fresh produce on the radar screens of people. We did a great job in the avocado industry, and now I'm working in pears. You could have the dietary guidelines could have really made a huge emphasis on promoting more fruits and vegetables and natural sources of sugars, and how it's so important for kids or across the lifespan for different ages, and really doing some education and promotion of like these fiber rich also foods that contain natural sugars. And there was like the opportunity was completely missed, aside from a little bit of clip art in the graphics. So
I saw that there was a post released earlier about the war on protein and how it's coming to the end. And I certainly see that consistent within these guidelines, because I look at this and I certainly think meat, meat, meat. It's like that meme from Lord of the Rings of like, looks like meat's back on the menu, boys, kind of a thing. But that's also just inconsistent with like what we have seen, because does anybody on this call think there has ever been a war on protein? That's like the only macronutrient that everybody has always been behind. We've gone after carbohydrates, we've gone after fats. Protein's just been sitting in the background being cool, like, hey guys, it's cool. Take it easy.
Well, and I think protein's always, the it girl, because everything comes out with protein. Every celebrity comes out with protein, right? I mean, there's protein Pop-Tarts now, for crying out loud. Like, that's not like a protein Pop-Tart is still a Pop-Tart, right? So I agree with Barb. Like, there could have been such an opportunity to amplify fruits and vegetables and really fiber rich foods and having a balanced plate. And I will say, like, they did a very good job in saying that, the old way of the dietary guidelines were making people unhealthy, and that we know as clinicians that's not what's making Americans healthy, because they've never followed the dietary guidelines. They didn't even know what they were. And I've heard so much conversation in social media on like, well, before it was big pharma who was the head of the dietary guidelines and pushing. And I was like, at what point were pharmaceuticals discussed in the former dietary guidelines? Like, these are conversations I have had with people that I'm just baffled. But it is an opportunity for us to continue to amplify nutrition and really discuss it. And I will say, Dustin, like, I have seen some opposing views amongst practitioners. And I think that's the great thing about, we all have different approaches with nutrition. But I agree with you. Like, our focus should be on, hey, nutrition comes in all shapes and sizes. There's not one size fits, approach for everyone. And that's what makes us all unique practitioners. But the conversation should always be like, how do we move forward with people and help them understand who we are and what we do?
Okay, before we move on to protein, because you mentioned it, we are ending the war on protein. Um, I do like one part of the added sugar section, and I wanted to call this out because social media lately, influencers like to say like, oh, use honey and molasses. It's so much better than that white sugar that you're using. And that's so false, right? We know that as a dietitian. And I actually like that the guidelines mention that. They say like added sugars may appear on ingredient labels under many different names. And then they list it out and specifically do call out like honey, molasses, and some other things. I think that's good for our patients. I think that's informative. And then they also, mention that some foods and drinks, such as fruits and plain milk, have naturally occurring sugars. The sugar in these foods are not considered added sugars. I think that's also helpful messaging as well. Like we had mentioned at the top of the hour, we were surprised that grapes were on that picture because they say that grapes are a sugar bomb, which is like completely insane. So I like that they had mentioned the quote sugar in fruit is not detrimental. It's not added sugar. Now, let's get on. We have two more topics I want to touch on. I actually think protein will be sort of a short topic, I'm hoping. So the new protein guideline is to consume 1.2 to 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day. And then they mentioned to adjust needs based on your individual caloric requirements. So I will open the floor. What are our thoughts on this? Do we agree, disagree? And what are our key takeaways?
It's that I had a buddy yesterday tell me that it was like 0.8 grams per kilo and doctors are going to stop saying that. I'm like, what doctor is saying that to people? Because if someone were to say that to the lay person, they'd be like, so how much is that? What's a kilogram? Like they look at them with 20, 50, 100 eyes. So it's still in the kilograms, which is the right way to do it. So I think we all agree that it's better that it's higher. I just know that we've seen, at least in research on my side on performance, is like 1.6 is that optimal amount for maintaining muscle mass. And as we have an aging population, we should start shifting towards.
Okay, so I'm going to just jump in here quickly. This is a policy document. This isn't consumer consensus that everybody needs more protein. Every single American overconsumes, population wise, overconsumes protein. This is not something we're trying to fix a deficit. People are by and large consuming way more protein than they need to. Where there is a problem is in fiber, and nothing was really mentioned there. So in terms of protein, like it just is such a irrelevant thing to change the recommendation there when people are over consuming protein. Again, this is a policy document. This is going to affect school meals, app reimbursements, other things. So now that the protein recommendations have just gone off the wheels here or have gone crazy, I'm really hoping that SNAP reimbursements are going to go from, for a family of four, from $990 a month to well over $1,500 a month. I'm hoping that the school meal lunch program, the school lunch is currently reimbursed at, I think, $4.25 for a school lunch. Hopefully it'll go over $10 now, a reimbursement rate, and federal funding will just flow to support these added protein recommendations. That, of course, is money and cost, and that's the silver lining, that these protein recommendations are going to command more funding toward federally funded food programs. But it's completely irresponsible to make recommendations for populations, a population that is over consuming protein, to then make the recommendation even higher. It doesn't make any sense.
I like your optimism about, could this give more funding to federal programs? Because they're saying like one serving is 3 ounces of meat or 1 ounce of beans. So they're clearly recommending a lot of protein. But also I thought it was interesting, like when did that seems like a DRI. Like the DRI are what inform the dietary guidelines. It's not the dietary guidelines creating new DRIs. So the DRIs have not changed. The DRIs are still 0.8 grams per kilogram. Maybe the DRIs need to go back and look at research and update that, but it kind of went backwards there. DRIs are what inform the food pattern modeling, the dietary guidelines recommendations, and they just came up with their own number.
I want to add on to what Barbara was saying, because I'm someone who does like the increased protein, but from a policy standpoint, when I read the 2020 to 2025 document, that is something that does not need to be increased based on that data. Colorful fruits and vegetables are what need to be increased because that's what's lacking in the previous data, and that was not addressed in this new form. But when it comes to one-on-one, I'm biased towards what I like here. I'm going to admit it because I work in weight loss management. So I'm just like, oh, perfect. Now my weight loss patients are going to know. But then I looked at it, I was like, no one understands what 1.2 or 1.6 means. So I'm like, why did they make such a specific dietitian recommendation, especially when most people who need to lose weight have a BMI over 30? And I'm like, well, the formula changes, right? So I'm like, people are going to be over consuming something that as a population, we overconsume anyways. So that's where I see it getting a little, like, it doesn't make sense on a population-based level from my perspective.
So think about it, Crystal. Like if these, just let's pretend in this world, all of us, if these dietary guidelines came out and it was in a big shape of an apple, and they said you should be eating 10 or more servings of fruits and vegetables every day, like that would actually have some positive impact. But instead, we see a big, thick steak. Nothing against steak or red meat at all. I'm making pork tenderloin tonight for dinner. I, I'm a meat eater. But I think we're really doing a disservice. And if you just kind of think about what could have happened, what could have been done here to really have shake things up. Even the whole food recommendation, like we don't have to go into you shouldn't be doing this, you shouldn't be doing that. This is what you should be doing. Eat tons of fruits and vegetables until you're blue in the face. It'll transform people that are trying to lose weight, people that have heart disease, people that are in the gym. You know,
Barbara, I have to say, you'd love to sit in my classes. I often will teach that Dr. Seuss's green eggs and ham, how he's like, would you eat them on a train? I'm with you on the produce. The NHANES data is very consistently shown we overeat protein and grains, refined grains. We are very low in the fruits and vegetables. I just like, at least on my social media, it was just very pro protein. I mean, that's what I was seeing constantly. And I'm with you that not only that was that very highlighted for the DGAs, but in addition, the photo, when you take the photo with the dietary guidelines, is showing skin on the turkey. It's showing steak. And then, so there's so much confliction with both the diagram and the recommendations when I feel like we could have done something with fruits and vegetables, which would have made the biggest impact on the obesity epidemic and the health of the nation. So it's not that as a scientist that I am against the increase, but I just feel like it brought too much endorsement to an area that is overconsumed. So I fully echo everything you're saying.
Okay, here I go again, offering pushback. I like the increase. I'm sorry, I'll have nothing but love and respect for Barb, but I actually agree that an increase was needed. Now, here's the case about this. Barb is completely correct. I think according to the data that we do have, you demonstrate that Americans meet the recommendation of 0.8 grams per kilogram. I think the last numbers that I saw, it was somewhere around 1 to 1.1 is what your average American is doing. Here's the problem. The rec is too low. I think scientifically there's a very sound argument to highlight how the recommendation should be higher. It should not be 0.8. And there's a long-winded answer to this, but I'll just keep it brief to not take over too much of the conversation. There's good evidence pointing about how that initial recommendation with the nitrogenous studies involved in it was for maintenance and adequacy. That's not the same thing as maintaining lean body mass and building and enhancing lean body mass. And I think that with an up in the rec, it'll help increase it to those levels that'll be of benefit to patients, especially for an aging population. Now, the catch to this is 1.6 is really high. That's what I eat. That's in levels of muscle protein synthesis for gym bros and muscle mommies who are going to the gym and getting ripped. That might be a little too high, but the increase, I think, overall was good. And I don't think I had to necessarily choose between my protein and my fiber, although you're completely valid in the points about how there is more fiber intake needed. And if I had to pick between two targets, I'd probably pick the fiber over the protein if I had to choose between the two.
we can still be friends, Dustin.
That people aren't hitting that level, though. Do you think, Dustin, people are under eating protein? Do you think they're not hitting that level?
I think what you're getting is, I think that you're getting that again, the level of where it should be at. I think for a consistent across the lifespan, I think should be elevated. I think where you're seeing people who are meeting it consistently are people like in their mid 30s, late 20s, early 40s, and I think it starts to dramatically taper after that and doesn't hit those levels previous to that. So I think that's why the recommendation would help make it more appropriate for everyone specifically.
You know, if you look at NHANES data, you can see that people do overconsume protein. So they are getting close to that 1 to 1.2 grams per kilogram of body weight right now. So now we've moved the target a little bit higher. They're going to be consuming more. So again, I will just reiterate and thank you for agreeing with me that we could have chosen fiber as the focus and the fruit and vegetable messaging where people are sorely lacking. My entire 25-year career as a dietitian, 1 in 10 Americans consumes the recommended fruits and vegetables. Just think how it could revolutionize body weight and chronic disease risk.
We are coming to the top of the hour, and I want to talk about the fourth and final thing that's pretty different in these dietary guidelines compared to the previous ones, and that's talking about the recommendation for alcoholic beverages. who called it the social lubricant. Oh my gosh, I hate that, but I digress. Our new guidelines say consume less alcohol for better overall health. Now, for those of you who do not know, previous guidelines were 2 alcoholic beverages for men, 1 for women. And so I love your take, guys. How do you feel about the word limit?
Like, to make recommendations on alcohol, a known toxin is just that's not where the science was evolving to for this, for the next if this was a normal preparation of scientific committee for dietary guidelines, um, alcohol probably would not have even been included. Um, and the silver lining again, consumers are drinking less alcohol today than they ever have in history. And so fortunately, consumers will continue with the trend towards consuming less alcohol. To include recommendations on alcoholic beverages, again, even if it's a slight decrease, is clearly misguided.
Can I just
Dumb
say too,
is
I
what you
thought
meant
it
to
was
say.
just I just thought it was really odd that we told children no sugar till age 10. And then adults were like, just less alcohol. Like, I felt bad for the kids. But no, I agree with Barb. I think you don't base your recommendations off of social reasons. This is health recommendations and guidelines. So if the research is suggesting there is no benefit from alcohol, and that's where the research is going and pretty solid, then I think they should have just flat out said, no recommendation. Yeah, given a stricter guidance, and then you use your judgment. We live in a free country. If you want to go use it or drink, then you do that. But for health perspective, it was so odd to not provide more detailed recommendations, at least from a health perspective.
Yeah, and I find it interesting because just last year in 2025, the US Surgeon General came out with their new recommendations on how alcohol intake is linked to 7 leading causes of cancer, right? So, like, we had some really good data from that document and great graphics. Like, it was really, really, I felt like a helpful piece of information that came out. And we do know it's a toxin. I also find that messaging interesting coming from the individuals who created these guidelines. Going back to using buzzwords and fear mongering, the word toxic is really thrown around often. We call like literally everything like oatmeal is toxic, seed oils are toxic, grapes are toxic, right? But yet there's no messaging around alcohol being toxic. And I think it should be. Like, if we're going to call anything toxic, that's a great word to use for it. And so I just hate the word limit because there's no definition. It's just like I'm in the picky eater space. Marina, when people say my kid is, quote, picky, I have no idea what that means. Do they not sit at the table? Will they not eat broccoli? Do they just not eat enough according to your standards, mom, right? So limit, how much does that mean? What does that mean for the general consumer?
No, I personally would have liked to see the recommendations more refined and more definitive, because when I work in weight management, a lot of patients, I do have to have a discussion with them about limiting your alcohol, but I need a defined definition, because when people come to give you a like a diet recall, they do underreport, because no one wants to actually report how much alcohol they're actually drinking. And I can't tell people they're alcoholics. But from what I'm seeing, drinking 11 drinks over a weekend every weekend is absolutely alcoholic behavior. And I feel like if the government on a policy level is being too loosey-goosey about this, you're again leaving things way open to patient interpretation of what they think limit is versus what from a health perspective should be recommended to overall make the country healthy.
I was going to jump in and say that on the science report of where they justified that, removing the specific objective limitation of how much you should be limiting your drinks to, it's one study, and it's looking at B12 supplementation in vegans. That is what they reference in the scientific report. So
That's
I'm glad that I
wild.
get to say that I'm
Yeah.
completely in line with everybody and I don't have to push against Barb again on this one. Yes, I hate it. Completely, totally, fully.
That's wild.
Can I tell you guys too? So I live in the UK and I practice in the UK, but here it's very specific. It's no more than 14 units per week, and um it defines what a unit is very clearly in the guidelines, and 2 alcohol-free days. And I think those 2 alcohol-free days are so important, because then you're like, "Oh, I don't need to drink every day."
I've loved unpacking these differences in this new guideline, and we've talked about it briefly, but I want to end our conversation with just understanding and hearing from you. What do you think is missing? I know I mentioned plant-based milks. I think that was a big miss. Barb had mentioned fiber. So if you guys want to jump in and share anything else that maybe we didn't talk about that you really wish these guidelines had.
I wish it was better at like how to plate the food, right? I love MyPlate. I love the diabetes MyPlate. That's how we've been using it for the last 15 years. That's all I've known as a dietitian. I don't know anything about the pyramids. But now the new guidelines, it's just saying 3 to 4 servings of, vegetables a day, 2 to 3 servings of fruit. It's not really giving a patient a visual of how they can make this a balanced meal when they're designing their own, how they want to manage their household, for example.
I would have loved to have seen something about culture. Last time there was a big shift on, cultural diversity, eating what works for you and your family, whether it's dairy, non-dairy animals. So that was a part of me as a Latina pediatric dietitian that I was just like, zero mention. And I think the last one is on access. And another RD I'm going to give a shout out to, a Mama Knows Nutrition, Kelsey, made this great analogy that said, as if somebody is giving you an instructional manual on how to do this beautiful dresser from Restoration Hardware. It's beautiful. It's just ideal. It's goals, right? But then once you're trying to find out the materials, you go and you can't find the materials, and you can't find even the tools on how do you make it. And so you want this beautiful dresser, you really want it, but you're trying to find those options, and you can't find them. And then you find other more cheaper, more economic options like the plastics, and you're like, yeah. So I think there was no mention of access, and like all of this, how do we get to these guidelines of this beautiful quote unquote pyramid if we're not talking about how do we actually help people get more fruits and veggies, even protein, right? So yeah, access and cultural diversity would have been wonderful.
Mexico released their dietary guidelines last week as well, and I kind of feel like that was almost an ironic twist on it for ours being released because I love their guidelines way more than ours. But specific to it is it includes a point about social connection and enjoying meals together with other individuals, which is endearing to me. I think there's data to that. I think it's a human quality that is also factual. So that's pretty cool that they included that, and I really wish we had something pointing to the social enhancement of meals with individuals too.
I don't know anybody on the committee. I haven't even looked up who was on the committee, so I mean no disrespect, but really feel like they were thrown together, and the lack of sensitivity to diversity. Well, of course, they're not going to mention diversity, right? This you're not allowed to mention that word. Um, but I mean, the multicultural aspect is a huge oversight, and certainly access is an issue in terms of affordability. And there was not even one iota of consideration for that. There was nothing even about preparing meals. I mean, even if you're using, oh my gosh, processed foods, of course, there's no definition of processed foods, but say you're using canned beans or canned vegetables or frozen, these are all processed foods. Um, like prepare those at home, or how to make foods healthier based on the budget that your family has. Even mentioning nutrition professionals, credentialed, registered dietitians as licensed in 48 states in the country as great resources. None of that was mentioned.
I'm so glad we finished with those main topics, especially cultural diversity and access, because no matter how wonderful the guidelines are, if no one can afford the food that we're telling them to eat, it is a moot point. So I'm so grateful for you guys to spend this hour and 20 minutes with me. This has been such an incredible conversation. I learned so much from you, but thank you for sharing your insights with my community. And for those of you listening, I hope that you now have some talking points with your patients. You have a little bit more clarity on what's the same in these guidelines, what's different, and what are some things that we can work towards in the future. And so thank you guys for being here. I will tag all of the guest speakers in the show notes. If you want to continue the conversation or follow them on social media, go check out the show notes. We've got a lot of resources and documents if you want to continue the learning. And as always, if you have any questions or concerns, send me a message on Instagram at Exam Room Nutrition, and I will see you all next week. But for now, let's continue to keep our patients healthy, one exam room at a time. Thanks, everyone.